Before we dive into the shocking true story of MS-13, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Every week we uncover real, jaw-dropping stories that the world rarely sees. Stories of survival, crime, and the hidden truths behind headlines. Join our community, comment your thoughts, and share your theories, because your voice matters. Stick around until the end, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see the streets, gangs, and the people caught in the middle. The first time Miguel heard gunfire, he never imagined the echoes of that war would follow him all the way to another continent. He was only 10 years old when his family fled the chaos of El Salvador's civil war. Their homeland had become a battlefield where disappearances were common. Neighbors vanished overnight, and explosions split the sky. For Miguel's family, there was no other choice but to leave. They packed what little they could carry, but most of what they brought with them wasn't in their bags. It was in their memories, fear, trauma, and a sense that silence was the only safe language. They arrived in Los Angeles believing they had escaped the nightmare. Instead, they found another version of it. The neighborhoods of Pico Union and Rampart, crowded with immigrants from all over Latin America, were already territories under siege, not by soldiers this time, but by gangs. Latino and African-American crews controlled the blocks, policing them with fists, knives, and guns. For the Salvadoran newcomers, life was no safer here than back home. They weren't welcomed. They were mocked for their accents, looked down on as refugees, treated as outsiders. Miguel and the other kids who carried the war in their bones realized quickly that, to survive in Los Angeles, they needed to form their own protection. What started as loose groups of young Salvadorans sticking together soon hardened into something else. A brotherhood, a shield, a name. They called it Mara Salvatrucha. The word Mara meant gang. Salva came from El Salvador. Trucha meant alert, sharp, always watching. At first, it wasn't a criminal empire. It was simply survival. A way for boys who had grown up around bombs and death squads to feel like they belonged somewhere. But survival has its costs, and when violence is all you've known, violence easily becomes the language you speak. The difference between Mara Salvatrucha and other street gangs of Los Angeles in the 1980s was their past. These kids weren't just angry, they were war veterans in miniature. Even as teenagers, they carried scars from battles most Americans couldn't imagine. They knew how to run, how to hide, how to trust no one. They had grown up in a war zone, and now, in the streets of Los Angeles, that experience made them unpredictable and dangerous. What began as defense soon turned into offense. And once they started defending their corners with fists, knives, and eventually guns, they weren't just another group of immigrants. They were a gang. The police didn't understand them, the neighbors feared them, and inside, the members themselves were split between two worlds, the children of a war that had driven them out, and the architects of a new war that was just beginning. The tattoos, the rituals, the code of loyalty, all of it was born in those early years. Slowly, almost without realizing it, Mara Salvatrucha was becoming more than protection. It was becoming an identity. But prison changed everything. The young Salvadorans who ended up behind bars in California entered a world that had its own rules, its own kings, and its own hierarchy. In that world, survival meant bending the knee to someone stronger. They found that power in La M, the Mexican mafia. The deal was clear: loyalty and tribute in exchange for protection. Out of this dark alliance came the number that would forever mark the gang. 13. It was not just a number, it was a symbol. The 13th letter of the alphabet, M, for the mafia. Adding it to their name made Mara Salvatrucha into MS-13. From then on, they weren't just kids from El Salvador fighting to survive in Los Angeles. They were part of a larger criminal universe. Yet the most decisive twist in the story didn't come from the streets or the prisons. It came from Washington. In the 1990s, US immigration policy turned toward mass deportations. Thousands of gang members, MS-13 among them, were rounded up and sent back to Central America. The plan was supposed to clean up American neighborhoods. What it actually did was export the violence. When these young men landed back in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, they returned to countries still bleeding from war, with fragile institutions, broken economies, and little chance for rehabilitation. Jobs were scarce. Support systems were non-existent. And these deported men carried with them everything they had learned on the streets and in the prisons of Los Angeles. In neighborhoods where governments had little presence, they became the law. They built new branches of MS-13, replicating the gang culture they had developed in California, but now spreading it like wildfire through societies unprepared to stop them. The United States hadn't solved the problem. It had multiplied it, planting the seeds of an international criminal network. In these places, the gang wars intensified. MS-13 fought for territory against rivals like the 18th Street Gang, turning entire communities into war zones. Extortion became routine. Murder was a message. Children were recruited. Families who had once fled violence now faced a new, homegrown terror. For many, the only escape was to flee again, fueling yet another wave of migration northward. The cycle of war, migration, and gang life spun endlessly, trapping generation after generation in its grip. Miguel, like so many others, saw what the Mara became. He saw boys he grew up with tattoo their faces with emblems of loyalty, swear oaths sealed in blood, and step onto a path from which there was no return. He also saw mothers crying over sons lost, not to the war they had fled, but to the new war they had created in their adopted home. The tragedy of MS-13 is not just about crime. It is about the weight of history, the scars of war, and the failure of systems meant to protect the vulnerable. The story of MS-13's birth is, at its core, a story about how trauma travels. The war in El Salvador didn't end when the guns went silent. It lived on in the children who carried its lessons into exile. It lived on in the streets of Los Angeles, in the tattoos inked on skin, in the codes whispered in prison yards, and in the deportation flights that spread that violence across an entire region. To understand MS-13 is to understand how war, migration, and policy intersected to create one of the most feared gangs in the world. It does not excuse the crimes they would commit, but it forces us to see the chain of cause and effect. For Miguel, and for thousands like him, survival in Los Angeles came at the cost of becoming part of a cycle that turned their pain into power, and their need for belonging into a nightmare that would haunt not just their communities, but the entire hemisphere. By the mid-1980s, Los Angeles was already a city defined by invisible borders. Entire neighborhoods were claimed by gangs, painted with graffiti that served as both warning signs and territorial flags. For young Salvadorans arriving in the city, these walls weren't just art, they were maps of danger. If you walked down the wrong street, if you looked at the wrong person, you could pay with your life. For the boys who had fled a war-torn El Salvador, it felt like stepping from one battlefield into another. Back home, they had lived under the shadow of soldiers, guerrillas, and death squads. In Los Angeles, the uniforms were different. Baggy jeans, bandanas, tattoos, but the message was the same: survive or disappear. The kids from Central America were mocked by Mexican-American gangs who saw them as outsiders. They were smaller in number, poorer, and easier targets. Even in schools, Salvadoran kids found themselves cornered, their accents ridiculed, their culture dismissed. To them, survival meant finding safety in numbers, just as they had in refugee camps and villages during the war. And so, what had started as a loose gathering of Salvadoran teenagers soon evolved into something far more structured. They gave themselves a name that carried both defiance and identity: Mara Salvatrucha. The word Mara was street slang for gang. Salva tied them back to their homeland, El Salvador, and Trucha meant sharp, alert, ready for anything. To call yourself Mara Salvatrucha was to declare that you were no longer alone, that you belonged to something larger than yourself, and that anyone who dared threaten you would pay the price. The birth of the Mara Salvatrucha was not about drugs or money at first. It was about dignity. In neighborhoods dominated by rivals like Barrio 18, Salvadoran youths were constantly at risk of being beaten, robbed, or even killed. By standing together, they began to carve out a space where they could walk without fear. At least that was the illusion. Protection quickly demanded violence, and violence quickly demanded loyalty. The group began to develop codes of honor, rituals of initiation, and a reputation that spread through the streets. The young members carried with them an aura that set them apart. Unlike many of the local gangs, these boys had already lived through horrors. They were children of war, and they carried themselves like survivors. Some of them had seen family members executed. Others had memories of running through jungles, of hiding from helicopters, of hearing their villages burn. To them, knives and guns weren't new. They were just tools they had already seen in another life. That made them both fearless and terrifying. When fights broke out, they fought with a ferocity that stunned their rivals. Slowly, word spread. Don't underestimate the Salvadorans. As the Mara grew, so did its sense of identity. Tattoos began to mark the bodies of its members. At first small symbols, then sprawling emblems that covered arms, chests, and faces. Each tattoo was a declaration: this is who I am, this is who I belong to, and there is no turning back. Music also played a role in shaping the gang's culture. Heavy metal, punk rock, and other rebellious sounds fueled their image as outcasts who didn't fit neatly into existing Latino gang culture. They weren't just mimicking the style of Chicano gangs. They were building their own brand, one that blended war scars, immigrant pride, and defiance against a world that had rejected them. But even as they built this identity, the Mara Salvatrucha began to mirror the very gangs they had once feared. Protection turned into extortion. Loyalty turned into control. Young recruits were drawn in with promises of family and brotherhood, but once inside, leaving was nearly impossible. Initiations became more brutal, and violence was no longer just a defense mechanism. It became a weapon to expand their power. The streets of Los Angeles, already saturated with gangs, now had a new player, one that carried the intensity of war and the hunger to prove itself. By the late 1980s, clashes between MS and rival gangs escalated. Barrio 18, one of the largest and most entrenched gangs in Los Angeles, became their natural enemy. The two groups battled over territory, each fight fueling more bloodshed, each death demanding revenge. For the police, it was another gang problem in a city drowning in gang violence. But for the Salvadoran community, it was something different. These were their kids, their nephews, their neighbors, the very children they had tried to save by bringing them to America. Now, instead of escaping violence, they were reproducing it, dressed in new clothes, speaking new slang, but carrying the same spirit of survival at all costs. The 1980s in Los Angeles were also marked by a crackdown on gangs. The LAPD, often brutal in its tactics, saw little difference between Salvadoran refugees and hardened criminals. Raids, arrests, and police violence further alienated these communities. For many young Salvadorans, the police weren't protectors. They were just another enemy. This only deepened the bond within the Mara. When the world outside is against you, the gang becomes your only home. Miguel, now a teenager, remembered the moment he realized there was no going back. A friend of his, barely 15, was jumped by a rival crew and left bleeding on the sidewalk. That night, the Mara retaliated, storming into enemy territory with knives and bats. For Miguel, the choice wasn't about crime or power. It was about loyalty. You stand with your people, or you stand alone. That night he crossed an invisible line. From then on, he wasn't just Miguel. He was part of Mara Salvatrucha. What none of them could see yet was how this brotherhood, born in exile, would grow into something far larger than they could imagine. At that moment, all they knew was the block, the schoolyard, the alleyways of Los Angeles. But the codes they were writing in blood and ink would soon outlive them. Carried into prisons, carried across borders, carried into the very fabric of nations. The birth of MS-13 in Los Angeles was not just the creation of another gang. It was the forging of an identity that blended the trauma of war with the brutality of the streets. It was survival rewritten as belonging, and belonging rewritten as violence. It was a generation of displaced kids telling the world, we are here and we will not be ignored. And from those first corners in Los Angeles, the Mara Salvatrucha was ready to step into the next phase of its story, one that would take it far beyond the city that gave it life. By the early 1990s, MS-13 had firmly established itself in the streets of Los Angeles. They were no longer a small group of Salvadoran teenagers banding together for protection. They had evolved into a gang, feared by rivals and law enforcement alike. Their presence was unmistakable. Graffiti marking their territory, a network of young recruits, and an escalating trail of violence. As the gang's reputation grew, so too did the attention of local authorities, state agencies, and eventually federal law enforcement. But the response that followed would have consequences far beyond the borders of the United States. The late 1980s and early 1990s were a time of growing concern in U.S. immigration policy. The arrival of large numbers of Central American refugees, many fleeing brutal civil wars, coincided with a rising panic over gang violence and urban crime. For many politicians and law enforcement officials, MS-13 represented a visible, tangible threat. The narrative was simple. These young Salvadoran immigrants were outsiders who had brought violence with them. The reality, of course, was far more complex. Many MS-13 members had indeed witnessed war and carried trauma, but the conditions they encountered in Los Angeles, the lack of opportunity, systemic discrimination, and exposure to already established gangs, fueled their evolution into organized criminal activity. In response to this perceived threat, the United States government ramped up its deportation programs. Immigration authorities began targeting gang members for removal, often relying on arrests for minor infractions, prior convictions, or even mere suspicion of gang affiliation. The logic was straightforward from the U.S. perspective. Send the gang members back to their home countries and the problem disappears from American streets. What policymakers failed to anticipate was the broader, unintended consequence of these deportations. Thousands of young MS-13 members, many of whom had spent their formative years in Los Angeles and identified more with the city than with the rural towns or cities of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, were sent back. These were teenagers and young adults with limited ties to the communities they were being returned to, many of whom lacked family support or social networks. They returned not as citizens, but as armed, street-hardened exiles, carrying with them knowledge of firearms, gang organization, and criminal tactics. They were, in many ways, veterans of urban warfare, transplanted into societies still fragile from decades of conflict and instability. In El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, governments struggled to reintegrate these deported gang members. Social programs were scarce, law enforcement was underfunded and often corrupt, and economic opportunities were minimal. Into this vacuum, MS-13 found fertile ground to expand. They re-established their networks, recruiting local youth and spreading their influence from one neighborhood to another. What had begun as a small survival gang in Los Angeles now began to take on the characteristics of a transnational criminal organization. The gang's operations expanded quickly. They engaged in extortion, drug trafficking, and violent enforcement, often using the same brutal tactics they had honed in Los Angeles. Streets and neighborhoods that had already been scarred by the Salvadoran Civil War became the battlegrounds of a new kind of conflict. Rival gangs, including the 18th Street Gang, were met with unprecedented aggression. Public killings, machete attacks, and ritualized acts of violence became common. For many communities, MS-13's presence was more devastating than the political instability that had prompted the initial migration. Ironically, the US policies intended to protect American cities inadvertently fueled the creation of a global criminal network. Each deportation carried with it the lessons learned on American streets and in American prisons. MS-13 members returned with a clear understanding of territory control, recruitment strategies, and violent enforcement. Their familiarity with firearms, their ability to organize cells, and their experience in survival under extreme conditions made them remarkably effective at expanding their influence across borders. What had started as a localized gang became a blueprint for transnational operations. The social consequences were immediate and devastating. Families in Central America found themselves caught between generations of young men trained in violence abroad and under-resourced local authorities. Schools were disrupted, local economies destabilized by extortion, and entire neighborhoods were forced into silence. Communities that had already suffered from decades of civil conflict were now facing a new enemy, their own children shaped by trauma, deported from another land, and determined to survive by any means necessary. The deportation wave also cemented the gang's cultural identity. MS-13 developed a sense of pride and belonging that transcended national borders. The name MS-13 became a symbol of resilience, notoriety, and brotherhood. Tattoos, hand signs, and rituals served not only as identifiers, but as tools for loyalty and discipline. Members who had once been lost children in Los Angeles now had authority and status in their home countries. This reclamation of identity through violence created a cycle that was difficult to interrupt. The more they exerted control, the stronger their organization became, the more embedded they were in local and transnational criminal networks. Law enforcement in Central America struggled to keep pace. Police forces were undertrained, underfunded, and often infiltrated by corruption. International cooperation was limited, and for years, MS-13 operated with near impunity, extending its influence from urban neighborhoods to rural towns. Meanwhile, the United States watched from afar as the deported youth who had once been perceived as a domestic problem evolved into the core of one of the most violent gangs in the Western Hemisphere. The deportation policy had succeeded only in one respect. It removed gang members from American streets. But it had failed catastrophically in another. It exported violence, trauma, and criminal know-how to a region already struggling to recover from war. The result was the transformation of MS-13 into a transnational criminal network, one whose reach and influence would soon return to US soil with devastating consequences. By the mid-1990s, the cycle was clear. Deported gang members trained the next generation, passing down skills, knowledge, and ruthlessness. MS-13's reach extended across Central America, creating a network that spanned multiple countries and set the stage for decades of bloodshed. What had started as a story of refugee survival had now become a global tale of crime, trauma, and systemic failure. In the end, the US crackdown and deportation wave illustrate a harsh truth. Removing individuals without addressing the underlying causes of violence and displacement does not solve the problem. It merely spreads it. MS-13, born in the shadows of civil war and nurtured on the streets of Los Angeles, had learned this lesson firsthand, and it would shape the course of their history for decades to come. By the mid-1990s, MS-13 had firmly planted its roots in Central America, particularly in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. The deported members who returned from Los Angeles brought with them knowledge of organized street violence, gang hierarchy, and survival in hostile urban environments. But what they encountered was not a peaceful homeland. The region was still grappling with the aftershocks of civil war, fragile institutions, rampant poverty, and communities struggling to rebuild. It was into this volatile environment that MS-13 expanded, exploiting instability to consolidate power, instill fear, and recruit new members. The gang's expansion was rapid and strategic. Initially, the groups focused on local neighborhoods, securing territory through intimidation, extortion, and public displays of violence. Their methods were brutally efficient. Drive-by shootings, machete attacks, and ritualized acts of terror became part of their daily operations. These acts were not random. They were carefully calculated to send a message. Any local or rival gang that challenged them learned quickly that MS-13 would not hesitate to assert dominance. The gang's reputation for ruthlessness spread like wildfire, and soon entire towns and neighborhoods operated under their shadow. Rivalries were inevitable. One of the primary conflicts was with the 18th Street Gang, also known as Barrio 18, which had established a significant presence in Central America. The battles between MS-13 and Barrio 18 were not mere street skirmishes. They were full-scale wars for control over territory, resources, and influence. These confrontations involved coordinated attacks, ambushes, and brutal retributions. For civilians, life became a precarious balance of survival. Attend school, walk to the market, or even leave home, and risk being caught in the crossfire. Families often barricaded themselves indoors, and children learned to navigate their neighborhoods with caution, acutely aware of which streets were controlled by MS-13 and which by rivals. The expansion of MS-13 was not limited to physical territory. Their influence extended into local economies through extortion. Businesses, from small corner stores to larger enterprises, were forced to pay taxes to the gang under threat of violence or destruction of property. In some areas, control over the drug trade became a primary source of income, allowing the gang to fund operations, bribe officials, and further entrench themselves in society. The combination of fear, economic dominance, and strategic brutality created a self-reinforcing cycle that made MS-13 increasingly difficult to dismantle. Recruitment became another key factor in the gang's expansion. MS-13 specifically targeted vulnerable youth, street children, orphans, and adolescents struggling in broken families. To these young people, the gang offered not just protection, but a sense of belonging, a family to replace the one they had lost or never had. Initiation rituals were violent, often requiring recruits to commit acts of aggression as proof of loyalty. Tattoos, hand signs, and secret codes reinforced commitment and identity. Once inside, leaving was nearly impossible. Members who attempted to escape were often hunted and killed, a warning to anyone considering betrayal. The social impact was profound. Communities that had already been destabilized by civil war now faced a new internal threat. Violence became normalized, public spaces transformed into zones of fear. Schools, parks, and markets were no longer safe. Families were forced into silence or exile. Children learned to hide their identities, to avoid wearing certain colors or symbols that might mark them as allies of one gang or another. Life in many neighborhoods became a daily negotiation with death. The gang wars also drew the attention of governments and international organizations. Central American authorities, often underfunded and under-resourced, struggled to contain the violence. Police forces lacked adequate training, and in some cases, corruption undermined efforts to enforce the law. International pressure increased, but the structural weaknesses of these countries made rapid intervention nearly impossible. MS-13 exploited this vacuum, strengthening its networks and expanding operations across borders with relative impunity. Despite the brutality, MS-13 maintained a rigid internal structure that allowed for resilience and coordination. Leaders at local levels managed territory, recruits, and operations, while directives from more experienced members, often those deported from Los Angeles, ensured strategic consistency. Communication through coded messages, tattoos, and intermediaries enabled the gang to coordinate across regions, making it difficult for authorities to predict or disrupt their actions. This structure was a key reason why MS-13 could not only survive crackdowns, but also thrive in an environment of chaos and fear. By the late 1990s, MS-13 was no longer just a Los Angeles origin gang transplanted into Central America. It had become a fully operational criminal organization, capable of projecting power, instilling fear, and maintaining control over vast swaths of territory. Its expansion was both physical and psychological, embedding itself in communities and in the minds of anyone who dared oppose it. The gang wars with rivals like Barrio 18 solidified MS-13's identity as a dominant, ruthless, and strategically organized network, a force that had moved far beyond its origins as a group of displaced Salvadoran youth seeking survival. In retrospect, the expansion of MS-13 in Central America illustrates how trauma, displacement, and opportunity converge to create enduring criminal networks. The gang's ability to exploit societal weakness, combine violent enforcement with economic control, and embed itself in local communities transformed it from a street-level protection group into a transnational entity. The story of MS-13's rise in Central America is not just a tale of crime. It is a case study in how war, migration, and systemic neglect can give rise to a phenomenon that reverberates far beyond its original context, shaping the lives of thousands of families and altering the social fabric of entire nations. By the early 2000s, MS-13 had evolved from a street gang into a transnational criminal network, its reach extending far beyond the neighborhoods of Los Angeles or the cities of Central America. What had begun as a small group of Salvadoran refugees banding together for protection had grown into a sophisticated organization with cells across multiple countries. The gang's international expansion was driven by a combination of strategic vision, migration patterns, and the relentless enforcement of loyalty and control. The foundation for this expansion lay in the deportations of the 1990s. Members who had spent their formative years in the United States brought with them an understanding of urban gang culture, organizational structure, and tactics of intimidation and violence. When they returned to their home countries, they found fertile ground for growth. But by the 2000s, the network was no longer contained to Central America. Globalization, increased migration, and the flow of illicit goods enabled MS-13 to establish a presence wherever Salvadoran and Central American communities settled. Cities across the United States, from New York to Washington, D.C. to Houston, became new territories for recruitment and operations. In the United States, MS-13 capitalized on immigrant communities that were often socially isolated and economically marginalized. Young people who felt excluded from mainstream society or who had experienced trauma similar to that of the original members were particularly vulnerable to recruitment. The gang offered identity, protection, and a sense of family. This ability to exploit emotional and social vulnerability allowed MS-13 to maintain loyalty and ensure continuity across generations. Initiation rituals remained violent and symbolic, enforcing obedience and solidifying commitment. For law enforcement, these communities became a complex challenge. MS-13 was not just a local criminal group, but a network with cross-border coordination, capable of rapid mobilization. Meanwhile, the gang's expansion into Mexico, Canada, and even parts of Europe reflected its growing ambition. Members facilitated drug trafficking, human smuggling, and other illicit enterprises, often working in cooperation with other criminal organizations when beneficial. In some regions, MS-13 became synonymous with terror, using public acts of extreme violence to maintain dominance and control. News of ritualistic murders, public executions, and intimidation tactics served as both warning and recruitment tool. The gang's reputation spread far faster than its physical presence, creating psychological influence over rivals and communities alike. Technology also played a role in the gang's global reach. Communication via encrypted phones, social media, and online networks allowed MS-13 leaders to coordinate across borders. Orders from leaders in Central America could be executed by cells in the United States or Canada, ensuring operational consistency and rapid response. The combination of physical presence and psychological influence made MS-13 a formidable entity in ways that traditional gangs were not, and it allowed them to exploit gaps in international law enforcement. This international expansion brought MS-13 into direct confrontation with governments and law enforcement agencies worldwide. In the United States, federal agencies began treating MS-13 as a priority threat, targeting leaders with RICO charges, large-scale indictments, and multi-agency operations. Internationally, cooperation between Central American and U.S. authorities intensified, though challenges remained due to corruption, limited resources, and jurisdictional issues. Despite these efforts, MS-13's decentralized structure and deep-rooted influence in local communities allowed it to withstand crackdowns and adapt to changing circumstances. The human cost of this expansion is staggering. Communities across Central America and immigrant neighborhoods in the U.S. live under the constant threat of violence. Families have been torn apart, children recruited or traumatized, and local economies disrupted by extortion and intimidation. Public spaces have been rendered unsafe, schools destabilized, and trust in authorities undermined. The gang's psychological hold is as strong as its physical presence, with fear dictating behavior, choices, and the daily lives of ordinary people. Yet, the internationalization of MS-13 also reveals something about resilience and adaptation. The gang learned from each environment it entered, adopting strategies that fit local contexts while maintaining core principles of loyalty, hierarchy, and violence. Tattoos, hand signs, and rituals provided continuity, while flexible operational methods allowed for rapid integration into new regions. Leaders who had once been teenagers in Los Angeles now directed complex cross-border operations, blending lessons from the streets, prisons, and deportation experiences. By the 2010s, MS-13 was recognized globally as one of the most dangerous and organized gangs in the world. Its influence reached from the barrios of Los Angeles to the streets of San Salvador, from New York City to Toronto, and beyond. The gang's story illustrates the unintended consequences of migration, deportation, and social neglect. Attempts to control violence in one region can inadvertently seed it elsewhere, and trauma left unaddressed can evolve into organized criminal enterprise. The international expansion of MS-13 is more than a tale of crime. It is a narrative about human displacement, social marginalization, and the ways in which survival instincts can be reshaped into organized violence. It is a reminder that policies designed without consideration for the human consequences can produce outcomes far beyond what is anticipated. And it is a story of how a small group of refugee children seeking protection and identity in a foreign land grew into a transnational force capable of shaping lives, communities, and nations. MS-13's global reach is, at its core, a story of adaptation, resilience, and the tragic consequences of trauma carried across borders. From the streets of Los Angeles to the cities of Central America and beyond, the gang's influence continues to reverberate, leaving a legacy that is as much about human suffering as it is about organized crime. By the 2010s, MS-13 had become more than a gang. It was a symbol of terror, resilience, and tragic human consequence. Its reach extended across continents, its members numbered in the tens of thousands, and its influence permeated neighborhoods, prisons, and social systems in both the United States and Central America. But behind the headlines of violence, arrests, and international law enforcement operations lies a more complex story, one of legacy, cultural imprint, and the ongoing challenge of addressing the conditions that allow such an organization to thrive. The legacy of MS-13 is tied to both trauma and adaptation. Many of its earliest members were children who had witnessed unspeakable horrors in El Salvador's civil war. They carried memories of violence, displacement, and loss into the streets of Los Angeles, where they found new battles to fight. These experiences shaped the gang's identity, teaching members that loyalty, vigilance, and aggression were essential for survival. Tattoos, rituals, and codes became more than symbols. They became a shared history, a language that connected generations who had never known safety or stability. In this sense, MS-13 is as much a cultural phenomenon as it is a criminal organization. The influence of MS-13 is both structural and psychological. Structurally, the gang has established networks that allow for coordinated operations across cities, countries, and even continents. Leaders in Central America communicate with cells in the United States, guiding recruitment, enforcing discipline, and coordinating criminal enterprises such as drug trafficking, extortion, and human smuggling. The organization's hierarchical structure ensures that even when individual members are arrested or killed, the gang remains operational. This decentralization and adaptability are key reasons for its longevity and resilience. Psychologically, MS-13 wields influence through fear. The mere presence of a gang member or the sight of graffiti marking their territory is enough to enforce compliance. Communities operate under the implicit understanding that defiance carries deadly consequences. Children grow up learning the boundaries imposed by the gang, neighbors avoid reporting crimes, and local businesses pay for protection under duress. This psychological hold is as powerful, if not more so, than any physical enforcement, embedding MS-13 into the social fabric of the regions it touches. The gang's influence also extends into the international perception of crime, migration, and security. In the United States, MS-13 is often portrayed as the epitome of immigrant gang violence, a narrative that has shaped policy debates on immigration and border control. While sensationalized media coverage sometimes exaggerates the gang's scope, the underlying reality is that MS-13 represents a complex interplay between displacement, social marginalization, and organized crime. Its story illustrates how trauma and neglect, when unaddressed, can metastasize into systems of power and control that span borders. Despite its reach and notoriety, MS-13 faces significant challenges. Law enforcement agencies across the United States and Central America have devoted considerable resources to dismantling its networks. Coordinated arrests, RICO prosecutions, and multi-agency operations have disrupted cells, removed leaders, and seized weapons and drugs. Governments have also attempted to implement social programs aimed at providing alternatives for at-risk youth, recognizing that breaking the cycle of recruitment requires more than punitive measures. These interventions have had varying degrees of success, often hampered by corruption, underfunding, and the sheer adaptability of the gang itself. The resilience of MS-13 underscores a broader truth. Criminal organizations are not merely collections of individuals, but products of social and historical forces. Poverty, displacement, lack of opportunity, and exposure to violence create fertile ground for gangs to emerge and endure. Even with arrests and prosecutions, the conditions that gave rise to MS-13 continue to exist. ensuring that the gang's influence persists. This reality makes addressing MS-13 not just a matter of law enforcement, but of social policy, education, and community building. The legacy of MS-13 also poses moral and ethical questions. Its members are often portrayed solely as perpetrators of violence, yet many were once children forced to navigate trauma, displacement, and systemic neglect. Understanding the gang requires acknowledging the human stories behind the headlines. The teenagers who fled civil war only to confront violence on the streets of Los Angeles. The young deportees who returned to communities unprepared to absorb them. The children recruited into a life they did not choose. In this sense, MS-13 is both a symptom and a cause, a reflection of societal failure as much as an agent of crime. Looking ahead, the challenges remain immense. MS-13's decentralized structure, international reach, and cultural entrenchment make it exceptionally difficult to eradicate. Efforts to combat the gang require a holistic approach that combines law enforcement with social intervention, cross-border cooperation, and community engagement. Preventing the next generation from joining requires addressing the root causes of vulnerability: poverty, trauma, lack of opportunity, and marginalization. Without such interventions, the cycle is likely to continue, with new recruits stepping into the roles left vacant by arrests or deaths. In the end, the story of MS-13 is not simply a tale of crime. It is a complex narrative about displacement, survival, identity, and the consequences of neglect. It is a reminder that gangs do not emerge in a vacuum, but in environments where human needs are unmet and trauma is left unhealed. MS-13's influence, though violent and destructive, is also a testament to the enduring impact of childhood experiences, societal failure, and the human drive to belong. The legacy of MS-13 is both a warning and a challenge. It warns of the consequences of ignoring trauma and marginalization, and it challenges societies to find solutions that go beyond enforcement. For communities affected by MS-13, the path forward is fraught with difficulty, but understanding the full story, the human, social, and historical dimensions, is essential for any meaningful intervention. The gang's story is ongoing, but its lessons about survival, identity, and the consequences of neglect remain as urgent as ever.